Hi there, I'm Shane, and in this video I'm going to be talking all about the iPhone 13 Pro and how it performs for both photography and video. I purchased it for myself as my phone a few months ago, and I've been using it ever since, and I've been really impressed by the features that it offers, and I'm excited to talk to you about them in this video. So for the past few years, I actually used a Google Pixel as my primary phone, but I recently made the switch back to Apple when I purchased the iPhone 13 Pro. I made this choice not pertaining particularly to the camera system that this phone has, but considering Apple markets this pretty much primarily as a camera phone, I made this review to share my opinions and thoughts on how it performs from the perspective of a professional photographer. In this video, I hope to go over pretty much everything about this phone pertaining to photography. I'll first go over the hardware, then the software, and then discussing the image quality coming from the hardware and software working together. But before I get started on that, I'll just go over the main features. This phone rocks 4 cameras on it. The first of which is the primary sensor, which has a 26mm equivalent lens with an f1.5 aperture. The ultra-wide is a 13mm equivalent lens with an f1.8 aperture. The telephoto is a 77mm with an f2.8 aperture. And lastly, the front-facing selfie camera is a 23mm f2.2 lens. These sensors also compared with a few other neat features like the LiDAR sensor stabilization, as well as the dual tone flash. But the real power comes from the computational photography that the processors in the phone actually add to the value of this system. And I'll discuss this more at length later in the video. For now though, I'll get on to discussing what you're likely here for, and that is discussing the hardware. And I'm going to be using a lot of example photos here, and they were all taken as RAWs. And it's safe to assume that unless I have text on screen, they're likely edited photos. So just keep that in mind as you're looking through these photos. They're not straight out camera for the majority of them. The main camera on this phone, or the ×1 zoom, is a 26mm equivalent lens, and it also has sensor and lens stabilization. This is a really versatile focal length that's going to be functional for both portraits, food photography, or even landscapes, whatever you really want. The other really compelling feature of this main camera is the fact that it has an f1.5 aperture, which is awesome just because it can give you a realistic shallow depth of field without having to rely on the portrait mode. And when you do use a portrait mode, it's just that much better, giving you a look that's comparable to something like a point and shoot camera, which is very pleasant aesthetic and just has a higher quality look to these photos straight out of camera naturally. And the sharpness on this main sensor is remarkably good as well. I found edge to edge, they're incredibly pleasing. Obviously not on par with what I'd expect from like a professional camera, but for a phone, it's incredibly good. A lot of people will be hesitant though when they see the 12 megapixel resolution, as many phones out there are creeping all the way from 20 to 100 megapixels. And this can actually be often a detriment to the image quality, even though the number is very impressive. The lenses in front of these sensors are often the limiting factor, depending on if they're made of plastic or some nicer quality glass. And often having these higher pixel densities and larger files can be more difficult for the computational photography to process because the sensor refresh speed will be slower and the low light performance likely will be hindered by the higher pixel density. So I think it was ultimately a good choice by Apple to maintain the 12 megapixel resolution rather than pushing the limits and losing out on a lot of their computational features. Moving on to the ultra-wide lens though, it has a 13mm equivalent focal length with an f1.8 aperture, which is, if you're familiar with ultra-wide lenses, almost a fisheye lens, and it can capture basically everything in front of you, including your fingers if you're not careful. It does so though with a minimal amount of distortion and an incredibly impressive edge-to-edge sharpness. Obviously, if you start pixel peeping in the corner of these images, they do start to have a really hard time in lower light situations just because the computational photography is really compensating for a lot of the weaknesses that you're seeing there. In the center of the images though, the sharpness is really impressive, and I found that they're entirely adequate for basically any social media stuff. But it's not like you're going to be blowing these up and printing them on a wall. But for on a phone, it's awesome, and I think it does a great job. The last sensor on the back of this phone is the 3x zoom, which has a 77mm equivalent focal length and f2.8 aperture, which is kind of your classic portrait focal length. It's great at isolating subjects, and it does so with a decent amount of real bokeh because of its f2.8 aperture. This focal length is going to be the best at getting subjects that are slightly farther away from you and getting a little bit of compression in those photos. The biggest drawback though is it seems to rely the heaviest on computational photography. It's great when it comes to faces, but when it comes to patterns or trees and very odd objects, it starts to look a little bit synthetic. I think for the average user it's perfectly adequate, but if you start really nitpicking these photos, they can look a little bit digital. The reason I'm emphasizing this so much is because Apple advertises the phone to have an optical 3x zoom and a digital 15x zoom. And when I say the processing is noticeable when you're just at the base 3x, once you start creeping up to 15x zoom, the images look like AI generated mosaics more than they do photos. And while they're entirely functional at capturing subjects that are very far away, these aren't images that I post online. So they're entirely good for documenting things, but I think it's a little disingenuous to say these are high quality images. And I think other phones that have these periscopic telephoto lenses do a much better job. So it's a feature that you really want on your phone. The iPhone doesn't have the best implementation of it yet. The last sensor to discuss on this phone is the front-facing selfie camera, which has a 23mm equivalent focal length and an f2.2 aperture. This is a nice spot between being an ultra-wide but not providing too much distortion, so it's great for taking photos of yourself or a group. Though if you do have shorter arms, you might want to consider a selfie stick just because 23mm isn't that wide if you don't have enough reach to really get the phone far away from you. What it does do though is heavily process your images because it utilizes the front-facing sensors used for the Face ID in order to process your images. And it does have the smallest sensor in the slowest aperture, but it does have the best processing capabilities, so it's a real pro-con situation. Ultimately though, for a selfie camera, it does a great job and it's entirely functional. It just is not going to be the best camera on the phone, which I would not expect it to be. So now that I've gone over all the cameras, I'll briefly talk about how they work together. And I think Apple did a great job at finding complementary focal lengths here. For the vast majority of the photos, the main wide-angle 26mm lens is going to be your strongest option, and I think it's the best image quality as a whole. However, if you want to get a little bit wider, the 13mm lens does a great job. And then again, if you want to get a little more reach, the 77mm lens is going to get you that telephoto look when you want it, but by far is the weakest link of all the cameras on this phone. Again, the selfie camera does its job perfectly. It's a selfie camera, though if you do need to get a large group photo with a couple other people, you can always flip the phone around and the ultra-wide lens is there for you if you want that. So I think the system works well together, and I'm really happy with how the focal lengths interact. Discussing the hardware though is only half the picture because a huge aspect to mobile photography is the computational aspect to it. And pretty much every photo you take is going to be a combination of multiple exposures that's refining the sharpness, dynamic range, colors, and basically every aspect of the image. And if you're going to believe Apple's marketing, your image quality is going to be greatly improved because of this. So much of this processing though happens behind the scenes, and especially in iOS 15.1, it's difficult to access, and the camera app is in a bit of a funny spot just because Apple does a really good job with their minimalist approach to software. However, it can almost be a little bit difficult to use because you just don't have many controls at your fingertips. For example, if you'd like to capture an HDR photo in previous versions of iOS, there was just a button for this. This was replaced though in order to feature Apple's new ProRes format, which essentially just is capturing a RAW image that has their processing baked into a DNG file, which admittedly is a really nice feature, but you just lost control over the HDR functionality now and have to always edit and post if you want to tone it down. Another new kind of pseudo feature Apple added was their photographic styles, which allows you to control the clarity and warmth of the kind of processing that happens before you take an image to have a more consistent look to the style that you'd like to edit to, and reduce how much you have to edit your photos afterwards if you want to have that consistent look. The thing is, Apple already had a feature somewhat similar to this called their Creative Looks, which essentially was a toned down version of this. But now you can apply 2 filters to an image before you even take one, which can get a little convoluted and might need some refining down the road. I don't mean to be overly negative though, because the app is still very well laid out and moving through the modes is very easy, responsive, and just overall is not complicated. And because of how many people have iPhones, pretty much everyone knows how to use this app, and is a big reason why Apple hasn't changed their UI that much or a lot of these features, because basically everyone knows how to use them already, and it's hard to make too much change without disrupting that. A big improvement to this phone, I think, is the night mode. And I think this is partially due to the fact that the hardware is significantly better and the sensor size is way larger, so low light performance is going to be better. However, the software does a great job of image stacking, so I find the images I've been taking at night to be very clean, and I find Apple is pretty consistent with sensing when it should be using a long exposure and stacking a little heavily. So you can always turn it off if you don't want it, and it turns on pretty consistently when you do. I just find it's a bit of a gamble to figure out what point that's going to be at. Another example though of the lack of control is in the macro mode, just because you don't really get to control when it kicks in. It just will decide you're close enough, and then it will use the ultra wide camera to get a cropped image that can get very close to subjects. The thing is, you can only turn this off, and you can't really decide when it turns on, which especially for macro photography is pretty important because it's hard to get your subject in focus. So it can be a little bit of hit and miss, and I think down the road Apple likely will improve this feature, but as of now it's just a little bit difficult to use. A great example of Apple refining a feature though is the portrait mode, which went from being essentially an experimental feature a few years ago to being almost a fundamental component of mobile photography at this point. It still does have a bit of a hard time with non-human subjects and can mess up with hair sometimes. However, it's a remarkably powerful feature that gives you real-time previews of how photos are going to look. You can control the simulated f-stop that you want, and I think it's just really fun to use, and I find it takes great images when you want to get a shallow depth of field images and you don't have your DSLR or mirrorless camera with you to get a properly high quality image, and it can get almost believable portraits now. I'll finish there with discussing the software though, just because I could go over all the nuances of the app, and the majority of the problems that I have can simply be resolved by using third-party software that gives you more controls or just does a certain feature better. And that's really a theme for Apple, because a lot of the time they're very slow with rolling out their features, but they really get them refined by the time they get them there. And they tread the fine line of keeping something easy to use while also making sure it's a powerful tool that gets high quality images. So I think they do a great job, and the app is certainly not difficult to use, and it's extremely reliable, and that's really all it needs to be. One massive feature I haven't discussed yet is the video functionality of this phone, and in traditional Apple fashion, they do a fantastic job at this. All the fundamentals are there, like 24, 30, and 60 frames per second in either 4K or HD, and the quality is absolutely lovely. It also has slow motion, time-lapse, and a new mode called the cinematic mode. All cinematic mode really is essentially portrait mode for video, while also adding a little bit of a smoother frame rate by frame blending and slowing down your shutter speed. It has a lot of intuitive controls as well as better subject tracking for what's going to be in focus. And the really nice thing is, all your focusing, racking, and what your f-stop is all editable in post as well, allowing you to really refine how the video is going to turn out. At the end of the day though, this is still a very new feature and has a bit of a hard time again with non-human subjects. Especially if I'm taking a video of my dog, it just has a hard time deciding where their hair ends and the sky begins. And I find when it's a busier subject, it almost is hidden better just because you can't see the mistakes that the software is making. Overall though, I think this is a really cool direction for Apple to go with their mobile videography, and down the road with some improvements it's going to be just as good as their portrait mode. It's just the first iteration of it and there's room for improvement. The other new feature Apple included on the iPhone 13 Pro is the option to shoot in Apple ProRes RAW, which is an incredibly high quality video format with very large files that give you a lot more latitude when editing in post. The thing is, for the vast majority, if not every user of this phone, it's almost a useless feature just because the files are so large, and how often do you need to have that much room for editing when you're shooting video on your phone? And if you want to shoot in ProRes, there's other cameras out there that can get you better video quality. However, it's a really neat feature that Apple included, and I think for some people this is going to be really valuable. So I'm never going to say no to having a feature like this. It's just not something that I find particularly valuable to myself. On that note, the last topic I'd like to approach is how the photos edit and the image quality as a whole. And this is a rather complex one to approach just because so much of it is based upon my opinion, as well as the fact that each camera relies on computational photography to a different degree, so having a really easy to comparable or blanket statement for the image quality is just difficult to do. As a whole though, if you want me to give a simple answer pertaining to the image quality, I think this is the best generational improvement Apple has made to an iPhone in a while. And I think this is mainly due to the sensor size increase across the board, and it's just resulted in a better consistency to the image files. When it comes to editing though, this is a much more nuanced answer just because it's going to depend what you want from the phone. For the majority of people, just slapping a quick filter on a JPEG is likely enough, and even for myself the majority of the time, this is all I want to do. However, I want to provide some value from my opinion as a professional photographer, so what I'm going to do for the rest of this video is discuss how I found the files edited when I pulled them into Lightroom as RAW files and really pushed them to their limits. And this is probably what you want to hear because if you're still watching this video, you're probably a power user who wants to do the same. When I was messing around with the DNG files, I didn't find any limitations really from the dynamic range of them, and you can push them pretty hard. The biggest limiting factor actually I found was the sharpness of the files, and I know earlier I said 12 megapixels was more than enough, and I still stand by this. I think it might be the fact that Apple's computational photography has a tendency sometimes with complex objects to have them almost blur together sometimes, and I found it was simply resolved just by increasing the sharpness of the file. And if I'm gonna have to choose between an over-sharpened digital file and an under-sharpened one, I always will prefer the under-sharpened file because it gives you more control when editing in post. So this isn't necessarily a con, it's just something to note that you can easily sharpen the images up a bit, and if you're finding they look a little muddy, that's an easy fix. With respects to noise, I actually found it to be quite well controlled, and Apple does a really good job with correcting this right away in the camera. And a lot of the issues I found when cranking up the exposure in post were more related to the HDR aspects and getting some artifacts showing up on the edges from light to dark, rather than seeing that stereotypical noise pattern, which is easily corrected with noise reduction if you do see it. So overall, I found the editing experience to be quite interesting. It's very different than editing my regular RAW files from a DSLR or something because you're really limited to what the phone thinks would make the best photo. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing because Apple does a really good job with trying to find the right settings, and when it does make that HDR image, it's usually relatively pleasing. It's not unrealistically light in the shadows or the highlights aren't gray. It does it in a good way. So a lot of the time just leaning into what the phone thought was correct is going to make for the best editing experience. Though if you do want to push the files pretty hard, they can take quite a bit of abuse, surprisingly, for a photo taken on a phone. Well, it's finally come time for me to end this video and draw my conclusions, and my goodness, this has been a long one, and I really appreciate you watching this far. I've had a lot of opinions, and I've come off maybe as a little overly critical, just because a lot of the opinions that I have been from the perspective of using a professional camera. The reason for this, though, is because this is marketed as essentially a camera first and almost a phone second. And with that in mind, at the price point this is at, you could purchase something like a Sony a6000 and a couple of lenses and get much better results in terms of quality from those, and have a lot more room for expansion because you can get new lenses and stuff down the road. Whereas this is a phone, and at the end of the day, that's really what it is still. It's a phone with a really good camera on it. It's not going to be the best device for everyone, but if you're looking for a phone with an excellent array of features, great build quality, and obviously a great camera, it's an excellent option, and I'm really happy with the decision I made when purchasing this, and I'm excited to use it even to shoot some B-roll for this channel. But if you have any questions about anything I said in this video, or have any opinions you'd like to express, please feel free to leave a comment below. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you or help you out in any way that I can. Anyways, thanks for watching again. If you do have the time to subscribe to my channel, that would be awesome, and liking this video really helps me make more videos like this, just as the algorithm has a very good bias towards people who like videos. Anyways, thanks for watching again. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.